There is a sacred, unspoken pact between a handler and his K9, forged in the fires of combat and sealed with absolute trust. When a Navy SEAL loses his four-legged brother behind enemy lines, the military calls it an unfortunate casualty of war. They close the file. But for Chief Petty Officer Dante Cooper, it was an abduction. For 3 agonizing years, he turned his back on his country, his family, and his own sanity to hunt down the phantoms who took his German shepherd, Brutus. What he found at the end of a 10,000-mile trail of shadows wasn't just the truth about his dog. It was a devastating revelation that would shatter everything he believed to be real. The heat in the Syrian desert did not just bake the earth. It suffocated the lungs and warped the horizon into shimmering, deceptive waves. Chief Petty Officer Dante Cooper lay flat against the crumbling rooftop of an abandoned municipal building, his eye pressed to the optic of his rifle. Beside him, pressed so close their breathing synchronized, was Brutus. Brutus was a 90-pound German shepherd, a combat tracking and explosive detection K9 whose intelligence bordered on the supernatural. His coat was a dark, mottled sable, blending perfectly with the shadows of the ruins. Brutus didn't just follow commands, he anticipated them. A slight shift in Dante's shoulder was enough to make the dog freeze. A subtle tap on his flank sent him moving with silent, predatory grace. They had been together for 4 deployments. They had saved each other's lives more times than Dante cared to count. Operation Sand Viper was supposed to be a standard extraction. Intelligence had pinpointed a high-value target moving through a remote village on the outskirts of Al-Raqqa. The SEAL team had moved in under the cover of darkness, securing the perimeter. But the intelligence was flawed. It wasn't a transit point. It was a heavily fortified stronghold. The ambush began with a deafening crack that tore the morning wide open. An improvised explosive device, hidden within the walls of the alleyway below, detonated with earth-shattering force. The concussive wave ripped through the municipal building, crumbling the rooftop beneath Dante's boots. The world dissolved into a chaotic swirl of pulverized concrete, deafening ringing, and blinding dust. Dante felt himself falling, swallowed by the collapsing structure. He slammed into the ground floor, debris raining down around him. His vision swam with dark spots. His left leg was pinned beneath a massive concrete beam, sending a blinding surge of agony through his nervous system. Through the suffocating cloud of dust, the sharp, chaotic staccato of enemy gunfire erupted. The insurgents were closing in, sweeping the rubble. Dante fumbled for his sidearm, his fingers numb and uncoordinated. Then he heard it, a deep, resonant snarl that vibrated in his chest. Brutus, the K9, had survived the fall. Through the haze, Dante saw the silhouette of his dog standing fiercely over his trapped body. Brutus's ears were pinned back, his teeth bared in a terrifying display of primal loyalty. When the first 2 insurgents breached the ruined doorway, weapons raised, Brutus launched himself like a heat-seeking missile. The dog hit the lead fighter with the force of a freight train, jaws locking onto the man's weapon arm. The insurgent screamed, his rifle clattering to the floor. The second fighter stumbled back, panicked, raising his weapon. "Brutus, aus!" Dante tried to shout, trying to recall the dog, to save him from the line of fire. But his voice was barely a raspy whisper, drowned out by the roar of combat. Another deafening explosion rocked the compound. A mortar strike from the supporting American forces, trying to cover the team's retreat. A chunk of masonry struck Dante's helmet, and the world went instantly, completely dark. When Dante woke up, The oppressive heat of the desert had been replaced by the sterile, freezing air of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor replaced the sounds of gunfire. Commander Thomas Reynolds was standing at the foot of his bed, his expression grim and deeply lined with fatigue. "Welcome back, Coop," Reynolds said softly. Dante's throat was dry as sandpaper. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his chest and a heavy cast on his leg stopped him. His hand instinctively reached down toward the side of the bed, feeling for a familiar, coarse coat. He felt only empty sheets. "Where is he?" Dante croaked, panic instantly spiking his heart rate. "Where's Brutus?" Reynolds looked down, shifting his weight. It was the look every soldier dreaded. "Dante, we secured the area after the airstrike. We pulled you out of the rubble. You were buried deep." "Where is my dog, Tom?" Dante's voice broke, rising in volume. "He's gone, Coop. MIA. We swept the grid twice. There was nothing left in that sector after the bombardment. I'm sorry. He did his job. He saved your life." "No," Dante whispered, his chest heaving against the medical restraints. "No, you don't understand. If he was dead, you would have found him. He wouldn't leave me. He was taken." "Dante, the blast radius." "He was taken," Dante roared, the monitors beside his bed screaming in alarm as nurses rushed into the room. As they pushed him back down, injecting a sedative into his IV, Dante stared at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling. He knew his dog. He knew the insurgents valued trained American K9s as trophies and psychological weapons. Brutus wasn't dead. He was out there. And Dante had left him behind. 14 months later, the military had officially moved on. Dante Cooper had been medically discharged, his left leg held together by titanium rods and sheer stubbornness. He lived in a sparsely furnished, single-story house in the quiet suburbs of San Diego, but his mind was permanently trapped in the Syrian dust. Civilian life felt like a poorly translated foreign language. Dante didn't sleep in his bed. He slept on the floor of his living room, surrounded by topographical maps, satellite printouts, and glowing computer monitors. His military pension and disability checks funded a singular, obsessive purpose. He spent his nights scouring the dark corners of the internet. He frequented encrypted forums used by private military contractors, illicit arms dealers, and underground exotic animal traders. He knew that a fully trained, combat-experienced SEAL, K9, was a highly lucrative asset on the black market. Cartels wanted them for guarding compounds. Rogue mercenaries wanted them for tracking. Wealthy, sadistic syndicates used them for underground fighting rings. His former teammates tried to intervene. They invited him to barbecues, suggested therapy, told him he needed to let the ghost go. Dante simply stopped answering their calls. He had become a ghost himself. Then, on a rainy Tuesday at 3 a.m., a ping echoed from one of his secure dark web trackers. Dante sat up, his joints aching as he limped to his desk. He opened the encrypted message board, a hidden forum known as The Bazaar, primarily used by fixers in North Africa and Eastern Europe. A user operating under the handle Jackal_99 had posted a listing for a highly trained tactical asset. There were 3 low-resolution photographs attached. The first showed a concrete cell. The second showed a heavy, reinforced steel door. The third showed the asset. Dante stopped breathing. The image was grainy, taken in low light, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was a large German shepherd, chained to a thick iron ring in a stone wall. The dog looked thinner, its coat dull and matted with dirt, but its posture was defiant, back straight, ears fully alert. Dante zoomed in on the dog's left ear. During a training exercise years ago in Coronado, Brutus had caught his ear on a jagged piece of razor wire, tearing off the very tip. It had healed into a distinct, flat edge. Dante magnified the pixels until they blurred into squares. The flat edge was there. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He downloaded the image and ran it through a high-end photo enhancement software he had purchased from a former intelligence analyst. As the image cleared, another detail emerged. When Brutus had cracked a canine tooth on a Kevlar vest during a takedown, the military vet had capped it with titanium. In the photo, the dog was snarling at the camera. A single metallic glint caught the flash. "It's you," Dante whispered, pressing his hand against the cold monitor. "I found you, buddy." Dante didn't hesitate. He knew the military would never authorize a recovery mission for a dog, especially not based on dark web chatter, and certainly not an unsanctioned op in a foreign country. He was completely on his own. He spent the next 48 hours liquidating his life. He cashed out his retirement fund, sold his truck, and emptied his savings accounts. He reached out to an old contact, a former Marine logistics officer named Arthur "Smitty" Smithson, who now ran a very quiet, very illegal supply chain for private security firms. "You're out of your mind, Coop," Smitty said, over a secure line, his voice crackling with static. The IP address on that photo traces back to a heavily fortified private military compound in the outskirts of Casablanca, Morocco. It's run by a Russian ex-Spetsnaz named Anton Krieger. The guy is a monster. He deals in weapons, human trafficking, and apparently stolen military dogs. He has 40 heavily armed guards. You walk in there alone, you're dead. "Just get me the gear, Smitty," Dante replied, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "And a one-way ticket to Casablanca." "And the exfiltration?" Smitty asked. "How are you getting out?" "I'll figure that out when I have him." 5 days later, Dante Cooper boarded a commercial flight to North Africa, carrying nothing but a civilian duffel bag and a burning, relentless fury. The leash connecting him to Brutus had been severed, but the bond remained. And Dante was about to pull that thread until the whole world unraveled. Casablanca smelled of sea salt, exhaust fumes, and ancient spices. For Dante, navigating the labyrinthine alleys of the old Medina was like slipping back into an old, dangerous skin. His limp was slightly more pronounced after the long flight, but adrenaline was a potent painkiller. He met his ground contact, a shadowy information broker named Elias Cole, in a dimly lit hookah lounge far from the tourist districts. Elias was a British expat with a cynical smile and eyes that constantly scanned the room. "You're a long way from sunny California, mate," Elias murmured, sliding a thick manila envelope across the scarred wooden table. Krieger's compound is an old French colonial fortress about 30 miles south of the city limits. Concrete walls, razor wire, infrared cameras, and heavily armed patrols. They used the place as a holding facility before shipping their merchandise to buyers in Eastern Europe. Dante opened the envelope, memorizing the crude blueprints and patrol routes. "Where are the kennels?" Elias tapped a finger on a detached structure near the rear of the compound. "Here. But I'm warning you, Cooper, Krieger has been bringing in foreign buyers all week. If your dog is as special as you say, he won't be held there long. He's a premium item." That night, under the cover of a thick, rolling coastal fog, Dante made his approach. He was clad in lightweight, dark tactical gear supplied by Smitty, his face painted in disruptive camouflage. He carried a suppressed Mk-23 handgun, a combat knife, and a specialized wire cutter. He moved with the silent, fluid lethality of a man who had spent his entire adult life mastering the art of unseen violence. He bypassed the outer perimeter sensors, timing his movements to the rhythmic sweeping of the guard tower's spotlights. He scaled the rough concrete wall, his titanium-reinforced legs screaming in protest, and dropped silently into the shadows of the courtyard. The compound was heavily guarded. 2 men armed with AK-47s stood smoking near the main logistics bay. Dante slipped past them like a phantom, utilizing the blind spots he had memorized from Elias's blueprints. His focus was singular. He could almost feel Brutus's presence, pulling him like a magnet toward the rear of the fortress. He reached the kennel building, a long cinder-block structure with a corrugated metal roof. The smell hit him first, a potent mix of damp concrete, fear, and animal waste. Dante picked the lock on the heavy steel door and slipped inside, drawing his suppressed weapon. The interior was lined with row upon row of chain-link cages. The moment he stepped inside, a low, collective growl rippled through the darkness. There were dozens of dogs here, mastiffs, pit bulls, malinois, all stolen or bred for violence, all traumatized. Dante moved down the aisle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He swept his small tactical flashlight over the cages. Cage 12, cage 14, cage 18. He reached the cage he had seen in the photograph. Cage 22. Dante stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He aimed the beam of light into the enclosure. A large German shepherd lay curled in the corner. As the light hit it, the dog stood up, letting out a weak, defensive bark. Dante sank to his knees, pressing his hand against the cold chain link. "Brutus," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Hey, buddy, I'm here. I told you I'd come." But as the dog stepped forward into the dim light, Dante's stomach plummeted into an abyss of cold dread. The dog was a German shepherd, yes. It had a dark sable coat. But both of its ears were perfectly intact. It lacked the titanium canine. Its eyes, wide and terrified, did not hold the deep, intelligent recognition of his partner. It wasn't Brutus. Panic, sharp and suffocating, clawed at Dante's throat. Had he been wrong? Had the photo been manipulated? Then the beam of his flashlight caught something hanging from a rusted hook on the wall just outside the cage. Dante stood up slowly, his hand trembling as he reached out and took it. It was a custom-made, heavy-duty K9 tactical harness. The nylon was frayed, stained with old dirt and dried sweat. Attached to the D-ring was a small, tarnished metal dog tag. Dante flipped it over, his thumb brushing over the deeply engraved letters. Brutus, K9-847 to U.S. Navy SEALs. It was Brutus's harness. He had been here. The heavy squeal of the kennel doors opening snapped Dante out of his shock. A guard stepped into the building, a rifle slung over his shoulder, holding a bucket of raw meat. Dante moved with instantaneous, brutal efficiency. Before the guard could even register the intruder, Dante closed the distance. He grabbed the man's rifle by the barrel, twisting it upward, and drove the pommel of his combat knife hard into the guard's temple. The man slumped to the floor with a heavy thud. Dante dragged him into the shadows, pinning the terrified guard to the concrete, the edge of his blade resting against the man's throat. "The dog!" Dante hissed in Arabic, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. The American military dog that wore this harness. Where is he? The guard's eyes went wide with terror, a thin line of red appearing where the knife pressed into his skin. "Gone!" he choked out, his hands raised in surrender. "He is gone!" "Where?" Dante demanded, applying a fraction more pressure. "Krieger sold him 3 days ago, a private buyer, a very wealthy man." "Where did he take him?" Dante's voice was a venomous whisper. "I don't know the exact place, I swear," the guard pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. The buyer came in a private plane. He spoke English, but with an accent. Russian, maybe. He paid triple the asking price. He said the dog was going to his private estate in the Carpathian Mountains, Romania. Dante stared at the man, the gravity of the situation crashing down on him. He was 3 days too late. Brutus had been moved across continents, sold to a phantom in the mountains of Eastern Europe. Dante slowly lowered the knife, knocking the guard unconscious with a swift strike to the jaw. He stood up, looking at the terrified shepherd in cage 22, then down at the worn harness in his hands. The trail wasn't dead. It had just gotten infinitely colder and far more dangerous. He unlatched cage 22, letting the bewildered shepherd out, giving the animal a chance to escape into the night. Dante clutched Brutus's harness tightly to his chest, the rough nylon serving as an anchor in the storm of his mind. He turned and walked back out into the Moroccan darkness. The hunt was far from over. It was only just beginning. The transition from the sweltering heat of North Africa to the biting absolute zero of the Carpathian Mountains was a shock to the system that Dante Cooper's broken body deeply resented. The titanium rods in his left leg turned into aching columns of ice, radiating a deep, persistent ache with every step he took. But the cold was a secondary concern. The harness, securely tucked into his tactical pack, was his primary source of warmth. Elias Cole, operating from his smoky den in Casablanca, had earned his exorbitant fee. Within 12 hours of Dante's escape from the Moroccan compound, Elias had hacked into the local air traffic control logs. He traced a private Gulfstream jet that had departed on the night the guard mentioned. The tail number was registered to a labyrinthine web of shell companies, all eventually pointing back to a man named Alexander Pierce. Pierce was a ghost in the conventional business world, but a titan in the underground economy. Born into wealth in London and educated in Switzerland, Pierce had built an empire financing private mercenary groups and outfitting rogue states with advanced tactical technology. He collected military secrets, weapons, and, apparently, highly specialized biological assets. His primary residence was a modernized medieval chateau nestled high in the unforgiving peaks near Brasov, Romania. Dante had to cash in his final favor. Arthur "Smitty" Smithson had connected him with a freelance pilot named Mitchell Hayes. Mitchell was a former Army aviator who now flew off-the-books cargo throughout Eastern Europe. "You are stepping into a fortress, Cooper," Mitchell had warned over the roar of the twin-engine turboprop as they navigated the treacherous mountain thermals. Pierce doesn't just have security, he has a small army, ex-military contractors from the States, Britain and France. Guys who failed psychological evaluations for being too aggressive. They operate with thermal imaging, seismic sensors, and drone patrols. It is suicide to knock on that door. "I'm not knocking," Dante had replied, staring out the frosted window at the jagged, snow-covered peaks below. Mitchell dropped him on a frozen logging road 10 miles from Pierce's estate, leaving Dante with a modified snowmobile, a heavy winter tactical suit, and a suppressed MP7 submachine gun. The approach took 2 grueling days. Dante moved only at night, navigating the dense, snow-laden pine forests under the pale glow of a crescent moon. The terrain was brutal. The snow was thigh-deep in places, forcing Dante to expend massive amounts of calories and willpower just to push forward. Every time he stopped to rest, the freezing temperatures threatened to put him to sleep permanently. But the memory of Brutus's empty cage kept his eyes open. On the evening of the 2nd day, Dante reached the ridgeline overlooking the estate. He lay flat on a bed of frozen needles, pulling his thermal binoculars to his eyes. The chateau was a breathtaking, terrifying monument to paranoia. High stone walls, centuries old but reinforced with modern steel plating, surrounded a massive central keep. The perimeter was lined with high-intensity halogen lights and rotating camera pylons. Through the thermal optics, Dante watched 2-man patrols walking the walls, their breath pluming in the freezing air. He spent 4 hours memorizing the patrol routes, timing the camera rotations, and looking for a blind spot. He found it near the eastern wall, where an ancient aqueduct had been partially integrated into the modern structure, to funnel melted snow away from the courtyards. The thermal cameras swept past it every 80 seconds, leaving a narrow window of opportunity. At 0200 hours, the temperature dropped to its lowest point, plunging the guards into a lethargic huddle. Dante began his descent. He moved like a phantom against the white canvas of the mountain. He reached the base of the eastern wall, slipping into the frozen trench of the aqueduct. The ice cracked slightly under his boots, the sound deafening in his own ears, but the whistling mountain wind masked his approach. He waited for the mechanical whir of the camera to pass over his head. 80 seconds. Dante fired a silenced grappling hook, the padded prongs catching the stone lip of the wall with a dull thud. He hauled himself up, his arms burning, his bad leg protesting violently. He vaulted over the top just as the camera swung back, dropping silently into the shadows of an inner courtyard. He was in. The air here smelled of wood smoke, diesel fuel, and something else. Something familiar that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The faint, unmistakable scent of wet dog. The interior of the compound was a labyrinth of modernized stone corridors and high-tech utility bays. Dante navigated the shadows with predatory patience. He encountered his first obstacle near the motor pool. A lone guard stepping out to light a cigarette, an assault rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. Dante didn't hesitate. He slipped out of the darkness behind the man, wrapping one arm around his throat to cut off his airway and using his other hand to control the weapon. The guard thrashed silently for a few agonizing seconds before his eyes rolled back and he went limp. Dante lowered him gently to the snowy ground, dragging his unconscious body behind a stack of fuel barrels. Following his instincts and the faint, musky scent, Dante made his way toward a massive, domed structure attached to the rear of the chateau. It looked like a converted equestrian center, its large frosted windows glowing with intense artificial light. Dante found a side access door, bypassing the electronic lock with a decryption device Smitty had provided. He slipped inside, instantly hit by a wave of climate-controlled warmth. He found himself on an elevated observation catwalk, looking down into a sprawling, brightly lit arena. The floor was covered in specialized rubber matting, set up with agility courses, bite suit stations, and urban combat mock-ups. There were a dozen men down there, moving with military precision. But Dante's eyes instantly locked onto the center of the room. His breath hitched. He grabbed the iron railing of the catwalk so hard, his knuckles turned white. It was Brutus. The German shepherd looked magnificent. His sable coat was brushed and gleaming, his muscles defined and powerful. But as Dante watched, a profound sickness settled in his stomach. A handler in a heavily padded protective suit was running towards Brutus, screaming in Russian and firing a blank pistol. Brutus did not flinch at the gunfire. Instead, upon a subtle hand signal from a man standing at the edge of the arena, a tall, sharply dressed man who could only be Alexander Pierce, Brutus launched himself. The K9 hit the decoy with flawless, terrifying technique. He didn't just bite the arm, he targeted the tricep, using his body weight to drag the man violently to the floor. It was a perfectly executed combat takedown, a move Dante had personally taught him in the sandy training pits of Coronado. But then, the unthinkable happened. Pierce signaled again. From the holding pens at the far end of the arena, handlers brought out 4 younger, heavily muscled Malinois dogs. They were brought to the edge of the mat, forced to sit and watch. Pierce was speaking to a group of men in expensive winter coats standing nearby. Dante pulled a directional microphone from his chest rig, pressing the earpiece into his ear. The American methods are superior. Pierce's cultured, arrogant voice crackled into Dante's ear. They don't just train the animal, they forge a psychological weapon. This dog, the asset from the SEAL teams, is our master key. We aren't just selling him. We are using him as the apex demonstrator to condition the new breeding lines. These buyers are paying millions for K9Es that can break a man's arm and ignore automatic gunfire. Dante felt a cold rage settle into his bones, far colder than the mountain air outside. They weren't just holding Brutus captive. They were exploiting his loyalty, using his years of service to mass-produce weapons for the highest bidder. Down in the arena, the decoy handler stopped struggling, waiting for the release command. Pierce looked at the handler holding Brutus's leash and nodded. "Aus!" the handler commanded sharply. Brutus did not let go. The handler frowned, stepping closer. "Aus!" he repeated, louder, raising a small, electrified shock stick. Dante's heart hammered against his ribs. Brutus was deliberately disobeying. The dog's jaws remained clamped down on the padded suit, his eyes locked onto the handler with the shock stick. Brutus's ears were pinned back, a low, rumbling growl vibrating through the massive arena. He was challenging them. "Hit him," Pierce ordered casually, turning back to his guests. The handler lunged forward, pressing the shock stick into Brutus's flank. The K9 jolted, a sharp yelp escaping his jaws, forcing him to release the bite. But instead of retreating, Brutus instantly pivoted, snapping his jaws inches from the handler's face. The handler stumbled backward in pure terror, dropping the stick. Dante felt a surge of overwhelming pride. 3 years. 3 years of isolation, abuse, and being passed from one nightmare to the next, and his dog was still fighting. The unbreakable spirit of a Tier 1 asset had not been extinguished. But pride quickly gave way to immediate tactical reality. 2 armed guards at the edge of the arena unslung their rifles, aiming directly at the defiant dog. "Stand down!" Pierce shouted at the guards, holding up a hand. "He is worth more than this entire facility. Put him back in the isolation kennel. Starve him for another 2 days. He will learn obedience." The handlers, visibly shaken, managed to loop a heavy steel catchpole around Brutus's neck. They dragged the resisting K9 toward a heavy reinforced door at the back of the facility. Dante watched them go, his mind racing through tactical permutations. If he went down there now, He would have to engage a dozen heavily armed men in an open arena. He would be gunned down in seconds, and Brutus would be lost forever. He had to be smart. He had to be a SEAL. He watched the reinforced door close behind his dog. He had the layout. He had the location. He pulled his MP7 tighter against his chest, quietly stepping back into the shadows of the catwalk. The extraction was no longer a rescue mission. It was a siege. Dante checked the luminescent face of his Garmin tactical watch. It was 02:45 hours. The sprawling estate had settled into its deepest cycle of quiet. The freezing winds of the Carpathians howling against the thick stone walls, masking the subtle scraping of Dante's boots on the catwalk grating. He had spent the last 40 minutes mapping the electrical conduits that snaked along the ceiling of the equestrian centre. Alexander Pierce's fortress was highly modernized, relying heavily on a centralized digital security network. That was its greatest strength. But to a Tier 1 operator trained in infrastructure sabotage, it was a glaring vulnerability. Dante traced the thickest bundle of wiring back to a secondary utility corridor behind the main arena. Bypassing a rudimentary keypad lock, he slipped into a narrow, humming mechanical room housing the facility's main breaker panels and environmental controls. From his tactical vest, he produced a small, pliable block of C4 plastique, pressing it firmly against the primary power junction box. He embedded a remote detonator into the grey putty, syncing it to a handheld transponder. He didn't detonate it immediately. He needed to be in position. Moving with agonizing slowness to protect his aching leg, Dante descended a maintenance ladder into the lower levels of the complex. The air grew colder here, the walls transitioning from drywall to damp, weeping stone. This was the older section of the chateau, the original dungeons retrofitted into high-security isolation kennels. A single guard stood at the end of the stone corridor, huddled into a thick parka, a Heckler & Koch MP5 slung loosely across his chest. He was stamping his boots to stay warm, his attention focused on the glowing screen of a smartphone. Dante slipped his thumb over the detonator button. He pressed it. The muffled, concussive thump vibrated through the floorboards, followed instantly by the deafening hiss of short-circuiting electricity. Above them, the massive arena went completely dark. The sudden absence of the humming generators left a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake, broken a second later by the shrill, mechanical shriek of proximity alarms. The guard in the corridor jumped, dropping his phone and fumbling for his weapon in the sudden pitch black. Dante activated his panoramic night vision goggles. The world burst into a crisp, glowing green. He moved forward, a shadow within shadows. Before the guard could shoulder his weapon or call for backup over his radio, Dante was on him. A swift, brutal strike to the carotid artery sent the man collapsing wordlessly to the stone floor. Dante dragged him aside and approached the heavy, reinforced steel door of the isolation wing. It operated on a magnetic lock, which, thanks to the severed power line, was now dead. He pulled the heavy lever and hauled the door open. Inside, it was a sensory nightmare. The air was thick with the scent of bleach and fear. There was only one cage in this sector, situated in the very center of the room beneath a grated skylight. Through the green phosphorus glow of his optics, Dante saw him. Brutus was pacing the length of the reinforced enclosure, his head low, his hackles raised in defensive aggression, reacting to the alarms and the explosion. When Dante stepped into the room, the dog stopped dead. A low, menacing growl began to rumble in Brutus's chest. In the darkness, The dog couldn't see his face, couldn't distinguish him from the men who had spent 3 days torturing him. Dante slowly reached up and removed his night vision goggles, letting them hang around his neck. He was completely blind in the windowless room, relying entirely on memory and instinct. He dropped his weapon so it hung by its sling, raising both hands, palms open. He stepped closer to the cage, the toes of his boots touching the steel bars. The growl grew louder, vibrating with lethal intent. Brutus was inches away, ready to strike the moment the cage opened. Dante closed his eyes, his heart hammering in his throat. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the scent of the dog wash over him, grounding him in a memory of a sun-baked tarmac in California. "Breakwater," Dante whispered. It was their secure recall word, a word never used in standard training, reserved only for emergency extractions when the noise of a helicopter or heavy gunfire made standard commands impossible. The growl stopped instantly. The silence in the room became absolute. Dante slowly dropped to one knee, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his joint. "It's me, buddy," he said softly, his voice trembling for the first time since he had woken up in that German hospital. "It's Coop." He reached out in the dark, sliding his bare hand through the steel bars. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then Dante felt a warm, damp nose pressed gently against his palm. The touch was hesitant at first, almost disbelieving. Then a wet tongue dragged across his wrist, frantic and desperate. A soft, high-pitched whine, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, escaped the dog's throat. Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled over Dante's cheeks. He fumbled with the heavy deadbolt in the dark, throwing the latch and opening the heavy door. Brutus didn't rush out. He waited, his discipline overriding his desperation. "Free!" Dante choked out. The 90-pound German shepherd launched himself into Dante's chest, knocking the seal backward onto the hard stone floor. Brutus whined and licked Dante's face, burying his massive head into the crook of Dante's neck, shivering violently. Dante wrapped his arms around the dog's thick torso, burying his face in the sable coat, inhaling the scent he thought he would never experience again. "I've got you," Dante whispered into the dark, tightening his grip. "I told you I'd come. I've got you." He let the moment linger for 10 seconds. 10 seconds to stitch their fractured bond back together. Then, the tactical reality of their situation reasserted itself. The backup generators finally kicked in with a heavy, mechanical roar. Red emergency lights flickered to life along the ceiling, casting the dungeon in a bloody, sinister glow. Footsteps, heavy and booted, were thundering down the stairwell outside. Dante stood up, wincing as his knee locked. He unzipped his tactical pack and pulled out the old, frayed, deeply stained harness he had recovered in Morocco. He knelt before the dog. "Gear up." Brutus didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, lowering his head so Dante could slip the thick nylon over his shoulders and buckle the heavy D-ring across his chest. The moment the familiar weight of the harness settled on him, Brutus's entire demeanor shifted. The shivering stopped. The frantic whining ceased. The terrified captive vanished, replaced instantly by the lethal, hyper-focused tactical asset of the United States Navy. Brutus moved to Dante's left side, pressing his flank tightly against Dante's injured leg to offer support, his ears swiveling toward the door. Dante drew his MP7, checking the chamber. "Let's go home." The red emergency lighting turned the narrow stone corridors of the chateau into a terrifying gauntlet. Sirens wailed a rhythmic, deafening warning, echoing off the ancient walls. Dante and Brutus moved as a single organism, a synchronization forged in the fires of a dozen war zones. They reached the top of the maintenance stairwell, just as a four-man security team breached the doors from the courtyard. They were heavily armed, wearing tactical vests and carrying assault rifles, equipped with high-lumen flashlights that sliced frantically through the red gloom. Dante didn't wait for them to acquire a target. "Strike!" Dante commanded sharply. Brutus launched himself off the top stair like a coiled spring. He flew through the air, completely bypassing the first two guards, and slammed chest first into the point man, his jaws locking onto the thick fabric of the man's tactical vest. The sheer kinetic force of the 90-pound animal sent the guard crashing backward into his teammates, breaking their formation and sending their rifle beams scattering wildly across the ceiling. Dante stepped out from the stairwell, raising his suppressed MP7. He fired in rapid, controlled bursts. Pft, 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 pft. Two of the guards dropped instantly, their armor failing to stop the armor-piercing rounds. The third man shoved Brutus off his screaming comrade and raised his weapon. "Aus!" Dante shouted, stepping forward. Brutus released the downed man instantly, dropping to the floor to give Dante a clear line of sight. Dante put 2 rounds into the third guard's chest, neutralizing the threat. The corridor fell silent, save for the wailing sirens. Brutus sat patiently beside the downed men, looking up at Dante, waiting for the next command. "Good boy," Dante breathed, his adrenaline spiking, masking the agonizing pain in his leg. They were making too much noise. The entire compound would be converging on this bottleneck within minutes. They needed to get above ground, out of the fatal funnels of the corridors and into the open where they had maneuverability. They pushed upward, moving through a grand dining hall adorned with antique tapestries that looked absurdly out of place beneath the flashing red emergency strobes. They burst through a set of heavy oak doors, stepping out onto the massive, snow-covered central courtyard. The freezing mountain air hit them like a physical blow. The courtyard was vast, leading toward the main reinforced gates of the estate. But their path was blocked. 3 heavily armored SUVs were parked in a defensive semicircle near the gate, their headlights blindingly bright, illuminating the falling snow. Behind the vehicles stood a dozen private military contractors, their weapons raised and trained directly on the doorway Dante and Brutus had just exited. Standing safely behind the wall of armored glass and armed men was Alexander Pierce. He was bundled in a luxurious sable coat, looking entirely unbothered by the freezing temperature or the blaring alarms. He held a high-powered megaphone. "Fascinating," Pierce's voice boomed across the courtyard, laced with a venomous amusement. "The ghost operator actually breached the walls. My security chief assured me it was impossible. You must be Chief Petty Officer Cooper, the man who couldn't let it go." Dante pulled Brutus behind a thick stone pillar near the doorway, assessing the tactical nightmare. He had 1 magazine left for his submachine gun and 0 cover between him and the gate. "You are trespassing on sovereign property, Cooper," Pierce continued, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "But I must admit, I admire your tenacity. Tell me, do you even know why you are here? Do you know why I paid €3 million to a Moroccan smuggler for that specific animal?" Dante remained silent, his mind racing. He checked his explosive pouches. Empty. He looked at Brutus, who was watching the guards intently. a low rumble starting in his chest. "You think he's just a dog?" Pierce's voice floated through the freezing air. "You think this is a sentimental story about a soldier and his loyal pet, but your government didn't abandon him because they couldn't find him, Cooper. They abandoned him because of what he swallowed." Dante's blood ran colder than the ice beneath his boots. What he swallowed. "During your operation in Al-Raqqa," Pierce explained, stepping out slightly from behind the SUV, emboldened by the sheer number of guns protecting him. "Your target wasn't just an insurgent leader. He was a broker. He had possession of a highly advanced, encrypted microdrive containing the identities and locations of every deep-cover Western intelligence asset operating in Eastern Europe and Russia. When the airstrike hit and the building collapsed, the broker was killed. But before he died, in the chaos, he shoved that microdrive into a piece of raw meat and fed it to the nearest starving animal in the rubble." Dante remembered the chaos. He remembered being pinned. He remembered Brutus fighting the insurgents. But before that, there had been a moment, just before the blast, when Brutus had vanished into the target room to clear it. "He digested the meat," Pierce smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach his eyes. "But the drive is housed in a biometric titanium casing. It can't be digested. It lodged safely in his lower intestine. The insurgents who took him didn't know what they had. They just saw a trained attack dog. But I have sources in Syrian intelligence. They tracked the drive's faint ping to the black market. Your dog is a walking vault, Cooper. He holds the keys to dismantling the entire Western intelligence network." The sheer weight of the betrayal crushed the breath from Dante's lungs. The military hadn't just given up on Brutus. Someone high up the chain of command knew the drive was inside the dog. They knew he was taken by insurgents, but instead of authorizing a rescue, they buried the intelligence, burying the dog's existence to avoid admitting they had lost the most sensitive data cache of the decade. They sacrificed a loyal soldier to cover their own incompetence. A quiet, terrifying fury settled over Dante. The institution he had bled for, the country he had sacrificed everything to protect, had written them off as acceptable losses. But they had miscalculated. They had forgotten that a SEAL doesn't stop fighting, and a K9 never forgets. "I don't want to kill the dog, Cooper," Pierce said, sounding almost reasonable. "The drive is fragile. A bullet might compromise the casing. Surrender your weapon. Walk away. I will arrange a discreet flight for you back to the States. You get to live. You get to be a hero who tried. But the dog stays." Dante looked down at Brutus. The dog looked up at him, his dark, intelligent eyes reflecting the red emergency lights. There was no fear in the animal, only absolute trust. Dante reached down, gently resting his hand on the top of Brutus's head. He looked back up at the blinding headlights of the SUVs. He didn't care about the microdrive. He didn't care about the intelligence networks or the men in suits who had betrayed him. "Pierce!" Dante shouted, his voice cutting through the wailing sirens with absolute, uncompromising authority. "You clearly didn't read his personnel file closely enough." Dante stepped out from behind the pillar, fully exposing himself to the firing squad. He raised his MP7 and fired 3 rapid shots, not at the men, but directly upward, shattering the massive halogen floodlights attached to the courtyard walls. The courtyard plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the headlights of the SUVs. Dante yelled the command with everything he had left in his lungs. "Brutus, havoc!" It was a command Dante had never actually used in the field, a theoretical conditioning routine, designed for multi-target threat neutralization in pitch-black environments. Brutus vanished. The dog didn't run straight at the headlights. He bounded sideways into the deep snow, using the darkness and the perimeter shadows to flank the formation. Before the private military contractors could adjust their night vision or track the movement, a terrifying roar erupted from their left flank. Brutus launched himself over the hood of the first SUV, tearing into the line of men. In the confusion and the darkness, the contractors panicked. They couldn't fire without hitting their own men. Gunfire erupted wildly, sparking off the armored vehicles, but Brutus was moving too fast. A blur of teeth and kinetic energy, tearing down targets and leaping to the next before they hit the ground. Dante didn't wait. Using the chaos, he sprinted across the snow-covered courtyard, pushing his shattered leg past the breaking point, his eyes locked dead on Alexander Pierce. The hunt was ending tonight. Chaos consumed the courtyard in a matter of seconds. Alexander Pierce's elite security contractors, accustomed to fighting men who utilized cover and suppressive fire, were entirely unprepared for the primal, non-linear warfare of a Tier 1 K9 in complete darkness. Brutus was not merely an animal. He was a heat-seeking missile cloaked in sable fur, guided by a singular, terrifying intelligence. Gunfire sparked wildly against the armor-plated SUVs, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the falling snow. Every time a flashlight beam cut through the dark, Brutus was already gone, having relocated to strike from a blind spot. A contractor screamed as the 90-pound shepherd hit him from the roof of a vehicle, driving him into the frozen earth. Dante Cooper ignored the agonizing protests of his shattered leg, pushing through the snow with single-minded lethality. He moved from shadow to shadow, his combat knife drawn, closing the distance to the vehicles. He slipped behind a mercenary who was frantically scanning the darkness, pulling the man backward and neutralizing him silently before stepping over the falling body. Pierce was shouting frantic orders, his arrogant composure entirely shattered. He had retreated behind the heavy passenger door of the center SUV, using it as a ballistic shield. "Kill the animal, forget the drive, just kill it." Two contractors converged on Brutus's position, their laser sights cutting through the snowfall. Dante saw them raising their weapons. Without hesitation, he broke cover, sprinting across the open ground. He threw his empty MP7 submachine gun at the face of the nearest guard, stunning him long enough for Dante to close the gap and drive his knee into the man's chest. But the movement left Dante entirely exposed. From his fortified position behind the SUV door, Pierce drew a customized, silver-plated Sig Sauer pistol. He didn't aim at Dante. He recognized that the SEAL was too fast, too erratic in his movements. Instead, Pierce aimed the glowing tritium sights directly at the massive German shepherd, who was momentarily pinned down by suppressive fire from the remaining guards. "If I can't sell it, I'll carve it out of him," Pierce roared over the din of battle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Dante saw the silver weapon level at his dog. Time seemed to fracture, slowing to an agonizing crawl. He remembered the crumbling municipal building in Al Raqqa. He remembered the crushing weight of the concrete and the sight of Brutus standing over him, taking on an entire insurgent squad to protect a man who couldn't protect himself. A handler never lets his dog fight alone. Dante didn't yell. He didn't issue a command. He simply threw his body across the freezing, open expanse of the courtyard, launching himself into the line of fire just as Pierce squeezed the trigger. 3 deafening cracks echoed off the stone walls of the chateau. The first hollow-point round tore through the Kevlar threading of Dante's tactical vest, shattering his collarbone. The second round caught him just below the rib cage, a devastating impact that felt like a sledgehammer driven by a freight train. Dante hit the snow hard, a spray of crimson painting the pristine white ground. Brutus saw his handler fall. The K9 let out a sound that wasn't a growl or a bark, but a terrifying, unnatural roar of absolute devastation. Ignoring the remaining guards, Brutus launched himself toward the center SUV like a mortar shell. Pierce panicked, trying to bring the silver pistol around to fire again, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Brutus cleared the hood of the vehicle and crashed into Pierce's chest, his titanium-capped tooth flashing in the dim light. The dog hit him with such concussive force that Pierce was thrown backward, his head slamming brutally against the stone retaining wall of the gate. The billionaire weapons dealer slumped to the ground, entirely motionless, his pistol skittering away into the dark. The three surviving contractors, seeing their employer neutralized and the courtyard painted in their comrades' blood, broke their tactical formation. They abandoned their weapons and fled into the darkness of the mountain estate. Silence slowly reclaimed the fortress, interrupted only by the howling Carpathian wind. Dante lay on his back, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Every exhalation plumed white in the freezing air, laced with a fine mist of blood. The pain was beyond human comprehension, radiating from his chest and burning through his nervous system. He felt a warm, wet nose press frantically against his cheek. Brutus was whining, a desperate, high-pitched sound of pure distress. The dog began licking Dante's face, nudging his shoulder, trying to force his handler to stand. "I'm okay, buddy," Dante choked out, tasting copper. I'm okay." Through sheer, unadulterated willpower, Dante rolled onto his side. He grasped the heavy nylon of Brutus's harness, using the dog's solid frame as an anchor to haul himself to his feet. His left leg threatened to buckle, and his chest felt entirely hollowed out. But the gates were open. "Forward," Dante whispered, his voice trembling. They limped out of the courtyard, leaving the fortress of nightmares behind them. They found the hidden snowmobile Dante had left in the tree line. It took every ounce of strength Dante had left to straddle the machine. He positioned Brutus in front of him, wrapping his bleeding arms around the dog's thick torso, using Brutus's body heat to stave off the rapidly advancing shock. The 10-mile ride back to the extraction point was a blur of frozen agony and fading consciousness. The dark pine trees whipped past them like silent sentinels. Several times Dante's grip loosened, his eyes rolling back. But every time he began to slip, Brutus would turn his head, barking sharply, nipping at Dante's thick winter glove to jolt him awake. The dog was literally keeping him tethered to the world of the living. When they finally broke through the tree line, the heavy, thrumming engines of Mitchell's turboprop plane were already spinning. The pilot saw the snowmobile erupt from the forest and ran down the lowered cargo ramp, his face dropping in horror as he saw the state of the seal. Mitchell hauled Dante off the machine, dragging him onto the cold metal floor of the aircraft. Brutus followed immediately, pacing frantically as the cargo ramp closed and the plane began to taxi down the makeshift icy runway. "Cooper, stay with me," Mitchell yelled over the roar of the engines, tearing open a trauma kit. He ripped open Dante's vest, his hands slick with blood as he packed combat gauze into the deep wounds. "You're hit bad, man, real bad. I'm redlining the engines. We'll be in friendly airspace in an hour." Dante didn't look at the pilot. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the world turning dark and soft. He turned his head toward the massive German shepherd sitting obediently by his side. Brutus laid his head gently upon Dante's chest, right over his slowing heart. The dog's dark, intelligent eyes were fixed on Dante's face, understanding the gravity of the moment with devastating clarity. Dante reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand, burying his fingers deep into the soft, sable fur behind Brutus's ears. "We did it," Dante whispered, a faint, peaceful smile breaking through the grimace of pain. "We made it out." Frost clung to the small circular windows of the turboprop plane as it pierced the heavy storm clouds over Eastern Europe. Inside the unpressurized cargo hold, the temperature was merciless, but Dante Cooper didn't feel the cold anymore. He felt a strange, terrifying warmth spreading from his chest, an indicator that his body had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. Mitchell was frantically working the radio in the cockpit, shouting coordinates to a US military medical evacuation team, demanding an intercept. But Dante knew it was wasted breath. "Hey," Dante murmured, his voice barely audible over the drone of the twin propellers. Brutus pressed closer, his large body curled around Dante's torso in a desperate attempt to share his life force. The dog's tail thumped once against the metal floor. "You're a good boy," Dante choked, tears mixing with the grime and blood on his face. "The best I ever saw." He thought about the corrupt intelligence officers who had abandoned this magnificent animal in the desert. He thought about Alexander Pierce treating him like a piece of merchandise. They had all underestimated the bond of the leash. They didn't understand that a K9 handler doesn't just train a dog, they give the dog a piece of their soul. And tonight, Dante had bought his soul back. Dante forced his heavy eyes open, locking his gaze with the shepherd. He needed to do this right. He needed to free the dog, not just physically, but psychologically. "Brutus," Dante breathed, summoning his final reserve of command authority. The dog's ears perked up, his posture stiffening slightly despite the grief radiating from him. He was ready for the next order. Dante smiled, a tear slipping down his cold cheek. "Mission accomplished, buddy. End of watch. Rest. Just rest." His blood-stained hand slipped from Brutus's neck, falling heavily against the aluminum floorboards. Chief Petty Officer Dante Cooper closed his eyes, and the war finally ended. Brutus did not howl. He did not run around the cabin. He simply lowered his head, resting his snout beneath Dante's chin, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. He stayed there, perfectly still, guarding his handler in death just as fiercely as he had in life, until the plane finally touched down on an American airstrip in Germany. 6 days later, the full weight of Dante Cooper's sacrifice crashed into the highest echelons of the Pentagon. Mitchell had delivered the SEAL's body and the dog directly to the authorities, along with the audio recordings Dante had captured on his directional microphone at the chateau. The military could no longer hide the truth. Under heavily armed guard, Brutus was transported to Joint Base San Antonio Lackland in Texas. He was brought to the Department of Defense Military Working Dog Veterinary Service, the most advanced facility of its kind in the world. In a sterile, state-of-the-art operating room, Dr. Walter Burghardt, the chief of behavioral medicine and the foremost expert on military K9 physiology, scrubbed in. Operating with meticulous, painstaking precision, Dr. Burghardt and his surgical team successfully navigated Brutus's heavily scarred intestinal tract. They safely retrieved the titanium-encased microdrive that had been lodged inside the animal for over 3 years. The intelligence recovered from the drive was unprecedented. It triggered an immediate, devastating purge within the defense community. 3 high-ranking intelligence directors were quietly court-martialed for treason and dereliction of duty. Alexander Pierce's entire underground syndicate was dismantled in a coordinated global sweep by Interpol and the CIA. The shadows that had stolen Dante's dog were dragged violently into the light. But for those who knew the truth, the geopolitical victories were meaningless ashes compared to the cost. On a crisp, brilliantly clear Tuesday morning, Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery was silent, save for the rhythmic crunch of polished boots on gravel. Dante Cooper was laid to rest with full military honors. The Secretary of the Navy was present, a quiet acknowledgement of the massive cover-up the Chief Petty Officer had exposed. The rifle detail fired 3 crisp volleys into the sky, the sharp cracks echoing over the rolling green hills and the endless sea of white marble headstones. A lone bugler played taps, the haunting melody wrapping around the grieving assembly. Arthur "Smitty" Smithson stood near the front, dressed in a sharp black suit. Beside him, sitting with perfect, statuesque posture, was Brutus. The German shepherd was wearing his old, frayed, tactical harness. He looked healthy, his coat shining in the morning sun, his surgical wounds healing perfectly under Dr. Berghart's care. But his eyes were fixed entirely on the flag-draped casket, suspended over the open earth. When the honor guard meticulously folded the American flag into a crisp triangle, an admiral stepped forward. But he didn't hand it to a grieving widow or a parent. Dante had no family left. The admiral walked over to Smitty and the dog. He knelt down, the brass buttons of his dress uniform gleaming, and gently presented the folded flag to Brutus. The dog carefully took the fabric in his teeth, holding it with absolute gentleness. The crowd began to disperse, the heavy emotional toll driving the mourners back to their cars. But Brutus did not move. Smitty reached down, gently touching the dog's head. "Come on, buddy. Time to go home. You're coming with me now." Brutus turned his head, gently setting the folded flag down on the pristine green grass at the head of the grave. He looked at Smitty, then looked back at the fresh earth. With a quiet grace, the massive German shepherd lay down in the grass, resting his chin on his paws, crossing them over the edge of the flag. He was fully retired. He was safe. He was a hero who had brought down an empire. But as he closed his eyes in the warm Virginia sun, listening to the wind rustle through the ancient oak trees, he was just a loyal soldier, waiting patiently for his handler to give the next command. If this story of Chief Petty Officer Dante Cooper and Brutus broke your heart, please know that their sacrifice wasn't in vain. It proves that the bond between a soldier and their K9 is a force more powerful than corruption, greed, or even death itself. These incredible animals give us their absolute everything, asking for nothing but our leadership and love in return. Let's honor the legacy of all military working dogs and their handlers who never made it home. If this gripping, real-life inspired tale moved you, hit that like button to show your respect. Share this video with a friend or a dog lover who needs to hear it. And please subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these incredible stories of loyalty, drama, and survival. Drop a comment below for Brutus and Cooper.